Okay, so people keep asking me to cover ships like the O class, P class, H class, etc., etc. Some also ask me to cover the overall program that planned them all. Plan Z. So, to put them all in context, sit back, break out the schnapps or your local equivalent, and let's talk about Plan Z, aka Hitler's dreams of naval domination. Hitler had already managed to negotiate his way out of the Versailles restrictions on the German navy, concluding a new treaty with the British Empire that allowed the Germans to build a fleet 35% the size of the Royal Navy, otherwise in compliance with the Washington and London naval treaties on ship displacement and main gun caliber. Hitler had promptly torn all of that up in private, at least, and initiated the construction of numerous classes of ships that flagrantly broke the treaty restrictions, whilst at the same time telling anyone that would listen that the rather obviously oversized Bismarck was really a 35,000-ton design. Honest. I mean, I suppose if you strapped a load of Zeppelins to it, you could reduce its displacement to that much, but really. But by 1938 he decided he wanted more, a fleet to challenge the Royal Navy on the high seas. A high seas fleet, if you will, because clearly this had worked so well the last time. German Naval High Command, rather wonderfully called in German the Oberkommando der Marine, had spent time thinking about this and come up with a plan. It was an initial plan, and it wasn't Plan Z. Plan X looked to expand the cruiser, U-boat, and Panzerschiff arms, the last being the heavily armed raiders akin to the Deutschlands. A lesser version, Plan Y, was also drafted, but Hitler didn't want lesser plans, he wanted battleships, and so Plan Z, which incorporated these, was the one that was adopted. This called for, amongst other things, 10 battleships and 4 aircraft carriers to tie down the main British fleet, and many long-range cruisers to attack British shipping. Curiously, given the experiences of World War I, only a small force of U-boats was requested. The plan assumed a decade was needed to complete it, and therefore there would be no war until 1948, since wars have an annoying habit of sinking ships. Hitler approved the plan and assured the head of the German Navy that there would be no war before then, and then promptly started a world war the next year, which put paid to the vast majority of Plan Z, as Germany's war industry needed to be turned elsewhere and supplies of key materials became harder to find. As expected, the Royal Navy also started this annoying habit of sinking German ships, which didn't help them either. Ironically, Plan Z's main effect, in reality, was to make the war easier for the Allies, since it meant that Admiral Dönitz did not get nearly as many U-boats as he wanted built before the war, as the money and material was being diverted to other naval projects. At this point, Germany had the Deutschland and Scharnhorst classes operational, and the 2 Bismarck class under construction. Plan Z allowed Hitler to order the construction of a further 6 H-class battleships, which would bring the fleet up to 8 true battleships in total, plus the 2 Scharnhorsts to meet the goal of 10. The rest of the fleet expansion planned would have looked as follows, going from the smallest ships upwards. Torpedo boats. With a goal of 90 torpedo boats, the Germans were building the Type 1939, which was called a torpedo boat, but was in reality a small destroyer. The next in line were, unsurprisingly, the Type 1940s, but as these were designed around materials that became available after the invasion of the Netherlands, which wasn't part of Plan Z, they can be ignored for the purposes of looking at what theoretically would have been completed under the Z plan. Save to note that these were ships that were similar to a Fletcher-class destroyer, and definitely not a torpedo boat. That's the 1940s. Instead, the most likely next design would have been the Type 1941 torpedo boat, which was itself the size of a mid-sized destroyer and armed to suit, with 4 single 105mm guns, with 1 forward, 1 between the funnels, and the last 2 superfiring aft. This was supplemented by 6 37mm flat cannon in twin mounts and 8 20mm flat cannon in 1 quad and 2 twin mounts. A pair of triple torpedo tubes on the centre line with some depth charge launchers completed the loadout. Equipped with sonar, radar, and a top speed of 34 knots, they were honestly relatively standard mid-war destroyers, held to the name of Torpedo Boat only because the actual German destroyers were even larger. Although their design was influenced by World War II, it's worth noting that the follow-on 1944 type were basically even larger versions of the 1941 with heavier flak batteries, and they were fully and openly ocean-going. About 60 more of these ships would have been needed to reach the target of 90. Destroyers. Whilst the Germans had experimented with some destroyers that were really verging on small cruisers with the 1936 A class, these being 3,500-ton ships armed with a main battery of 5.9-inch guns, heavy AA, lots of torpedoes and plenty of mines, all cruising at a speed of 37 to 38 knots, they had found these ships were far too heavily armed for their size, and follow-on ships had first dropped the main gun caliber to 5 inches in the 1936 Bs, but then increased the number of guns to 6 in the 1936 Cs. These very large destroyers would have been supplemented by the Type 1938 Bs, which were more along the lines of a more conventional large fleet destroyer. The two classes of destroyer built for the Z plan, therefore, would have been derivatives of these designs, with some being very heavy ships with 6 dual-purpose 128mm guns, 8 torpedo tubes, and a heavy battery of 20mm, 30mm, and 55mm AA guns, along with lighter ships with only 4 128mm guns, 6 torpedo tubes, and a lesser battery of around 18 to 20 37 and 20mm AA guns. All of the designs would have been capable of over 35 knots, and 38 more ships would have been needed to achieve these 68 vessels, compared to the numbers that were actually built. Scout cruisers. Germany was going for quite the unique fleet, whereas most navies had destroyers between 1 and 2,000 tons, and then skipped straight to light cruisers in the 8 to 10,000 ton range. Not only were the Germans building destroyers almost twice the size of the average, they were also going for what they called the Spar Cruiser, available in 1938, 1939, or 1940 patterns. There were arguments over whether these were massively oversized destroyers or in fact small cruisers, as they were of a size and armament comparable to the Arethusa-class light cruisers of the Royal Navy, but sacrificed basically all armour, apart from splinter protection, in exchange for a 36-knot top speed. Their 6 150mm or 5.9-inch main guns were arranged in 3 twin turrets. Much like with the Königsberg light cruisers, 2 were on the back in superfiring positions to allow for more firepower when the ship was retreating, since these ships were designed as the fleet's scouting forces. The 1939 variant sacrificed torpedo tubes for a seaplane and catapult, but the other two variants would carry 10 torpedo tubes amidships, with a fairly heavy anti-aircraft battery for so small a ship, with 2 88mm, 8 37mm, and 8 20mm guns. 22 of these ships were planned. Light cruisers. With the Emden, the 3 Königsbergs, and the 2 Leipzigs completed, the Z plan only called for half a dozen more light cruisers. These would be called the M class and were of a similar size to their predecessors, but they dropped the 3 triple turrets in favour of 4 twins, sacrificing a gun for a total of 8 150mm or 5.9-inch guns in what was rapidly becoming a standard 2 superfiring forward, 2 superfiring aft layout across almost all German large ships. These ships were also intended as scouts and shared a 36-knot top speed with the Spar Cruisers, but these were aimed to scout for commerce raiding groups as opposed to battle groups, which the smaller ships were supposed to service. Compared to their smaller relatives, they dropped 4 20mm AA guns and 2 torpedo tubes in exchange for a couple of extra 88mm AA guns and 60 mines, along with a couple of seaplanes. They were relatively thinly armoured with just a 2-inch belt, and the finalised design had a major weakness with all the turbines in the same engine room, therefore able to be disabled with a single hit. It was planned for the last 2 ships to alter this layout and, like with the Hippers, also be physically larger. Heavy cruisers. The Z-Plan didn't call for any further heavy cruisers after the Admiral Hipper class, although it did assume that all 5 would be completed as heavy cruisers and not tried to be converted into aircraft carriers or sold to the Russians. Panzerschiff. The original Z-Plan called for 15 of these ships, including the 3 Deutschland class already built. The remaining dozen were to be the P-class, which were improved versions of the D-class, which were themselves improved versions of the Deutschlands. The D-class had been cancelled in favour of the Scharnhorsts earlier in the decade. The P-class were much larger, at just under 24,000 tons, but they still only carried 6 11-inch guns in 2 triple turrets like the Deutschlands, albeit they were the improved and heavier versions used in the Scharnhorst class. They also only had half the secondary battery with 450mm guns. Armour was to be about the same, with maybe a little extra on the magazines, but only 2 triple torpedo launchers were carried as opposed to 2 quads on the Deutschlands. So, what were they more than doubling the displacement for, I hear you ask? The answer was mostly fuel and range, with a 50% increase in range and a 33-knot top speed. The 7 extra knots came with the need for just over 3 times the engine power. The anti-aircraft armament was also somewhat increased to 4 105mm and 4 37mm guns. These ships were completely dedicated to the commerce raiding mission. However, they would not even survive on paper until the outbreak of World War II, with Admiral Raeder first reducing the order to 8 and then cancelling them entirely in 1939 in favour of the next ships. Battle cruisers. Despite the plan only being active for just under a year, priorities were shifting fast, and the O-class reflected a change in strategy. Instead of sending out dedicated commerce hunting groups made up of the P and M classes, whilst battle groups forced the heavy Royal Navy units to stay close to home, the new strategy called for the former battle units to engage convoy escorts and fleet elements, whilst attached units such as the O-class went after merchant ships. Part of this thinking was that by having the standard raider be a battle cruiser as opposed to a Panzerschiff, this would force the Royal Navy to cover all convoys with full battleships rather than large numbers of heavy cruisers or potential supercruisers, thus weakening any roving fleet units that the H-class might run into. As a result, the 3 O-class were planned exclusively as merchant and cruiser killers, carrying a very thin 7.5-inch belt with a top speed of 35 knots, almost completely upending the World War I German battlecruiser concept that mandated protection above speed or armament. Along with 2 aircraft, the ship's equipment consisted of a main battery of 6 15-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, with a secondary battery of 6 150mm guns in twin turrets, 1 on each wing and 1 super-firing over the rear turret. 8 105mm and 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns in twin mounts, along with 20 single-mounted 20mm cannon, made up the anti-aircraft armament. 4 seaplanes for scouting were also included. Aircraft carriers. The plan called for a total of 4 aircraft carriers, 2 of the Graf Zeppelin class that were already under construction, and 2 more to a modified design to follow. These ships carried an anti-surface battery of 16 150mm guns in paired casemates, plus 12 105mm and 22 37mm anti-aircraft guns in twin mounts, and 7 quad 20mm mounts. Although capable of 35 knots, the heavy emphasis on the separate anti-air and anti-surface batteries meant that even at 33,500 tons, i.e. the displacement roughly of an Essex-class fleet carrier, the ship's air group would only amount to just over 40 aircraft, with modified Ju-87 Stukas serving in both the dive and torpedo bomber roles, and initially navalised Messerschmitt 109s in the fighter role. Use of the fighter with perhaps the single most unstable and delicate landing gear of the war in a carrier role carry-out role was perhaps one of the worst ideas that anybody had ever come up with, and a modified aircraft with a wider landing gear, the Messerschmitt 155, was due to be developed instead. Although little is known about the modifications planned for the second pair, it is likely that the gun battery would be reduced in number but increased in flexibility with a dual-purpose array that would thus enable more aircraft to be carried. There were also low-priority plans to convert merchant ships into light carriers, and even a few ideas bouncing around for hybrid cruiser and battle carriers. Battleships. Now come on, admit it, this is the bit that everyone was really waiting for, weren't you? 6 H-class battleships were planned. At least 2 of them would have been of the H-39 type. These were basically enlarged versions of the Bismarck class at just over 55,000 tons standard displacement and swapping out the 15-inch guns for 16-inch weapons in exactly the same 4 twin turret layout. 165,000 shaft horsepower would drive the ships at 30 knots, with a secondary battery of 12 150mm guns in twin turrets, 16 105mm and 16 37mm guns in twin mounts, and 24 quad-mounted 20mm cannon supplying the anti-aircraft armament, along with a rather unusual 6 bow-mounted submerged torpedo tubes. It is likely that this anti-aircraft suite would have been either augmented or altered by the time the ships were finished. Armour protection was similar to the Bismarck in belt thickness, but the armoured deck scheme was revised. The turtle back armour was still in place, but with thicker 150mm plating over the magazines compared to its predecessors. However, a secondary upper deck 2 to 3 inches thick was also planned, slightly thicker than the equivalent on Bismarck. It is not clear if this larger ship retained Bismarck's weakness of exposed fire control cables above the turtleback armour. All follow-on designs drawn up by the Kriegsmarine in reality were heavily influenced by wartime experience, or just plain fantasy, so they can't be used to gauge what the final 4 ships would have looked like. However, with the British building the Lion class, it is reasonable to assume that the second pair would likely have had their guns bored out, as was planned on the H-41 derivative, to 16.5 inches. By the time the last pair was built, it's likely the details of the Yamato would have become available, and larger ships with heavier guns would probably have been requested. But the H-42 through H-44 would not have been the ones selected, as they could not have been built in the normal manner due to their size. The most likely possibilities would either be another pair of revised H-39s with 16.5-inch guns, or a revised design with more armour and 3 triple 16.5-inch turrets, or possibly a version with 6 guns in 3 twin turrets, with the calibre being upped to a similar size as Yamato. Remember that the Yamato itself needed a lot of pre-planning in terms of naval infrastructure, and whilst I'm sure Germany and everyone else would probably have tried to respond, the ship they settled on would have been outside the scope of the Z plan. Now, with all that said and done, how realistic and practical was the Z plan? Well, we can look at 2 aspects: overall and individual practicality. In terms of overall practicality, this mainly comes down to cost, and it's extremely unlikely that Germany could have completed the plan in full without serious economic effects. Germany simply wasn't in a similar position relative to the other world economies compared to where it had been in the 1900s, and with the various plans to expand the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Luftwaffe, they'd either have had to scale back the scope of the Z plan or else find some additional source of funding. And you can guarantee that the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Luftwaffe weren't going to give over as much as a single Reichsmark to the Kriegsmarine if they could at all avoid it. But assuming that somehow a magical money tree was found, or Hitler just kept Anschlussing various countries without anybody raising an eyebrow, let's look at the individual designs. The torpedo boats were relatively practical, effectively being mid-sized destroyers by any other name, so I wouldn't foresee them suffering any major operational difficulties other than being thoroughly mocked for being a wolf in sheep's clothing. Destroyers. These were very oversized. The Narviks already had issues with seakeeping due to being overly armed, And whilst the first batch of Z-Plan destroyers might have dodged this, the later ships probably would have run into similar issues. Additionally, despite, and to be honest partially because of their size and armament, and thus cost, they would be at serious risk of being overrun, outnumbered and outgunned by swarms of smaller and cheaper destroyers that could still wield useful rapid-fire main batteries. Ships like the Tribals, the J through M classes, and the Sumners and Gearings all come to mind. Scout cruisers. Now honestly, I can't really see much practical use for these. Sure, they're designed for a very specific purpose, but effectively they're just very big targets for the kind of ship that they are. They can't fight cruisers, and with their lack of armour and size, they might even lose a fight to a single well-commanded destroyer. Anything bigger is just going to erase them from existence the minute they get the range accurate, so it would have been much better to spend the money on the light cruisers. These are only a bit bigger, and they're more analogous to the Leander class cruisers. Now sure, they're never going to win a fight with a Town class or a Brooklyn class, but as commerce raiders and scouts, they're far more effective than the scout cruisers, and unlikely to cost all that much more. Unlike their smaller relatives, they could actually fight destroyers, and in pairs would probably have had a decent advantage over most convoy escorting cruisers. Heavy cruisers, well, they're the Hippers, so go see my video on the Hipper class for my thoughts on that particular ship. Panzerschiff. Raider was very definitely right to cancel these. Compared to the Deutschlands, you're paying for a vastly larger ship that's actually going to do worse in a gunfight with cruiser squadrons, owing it to it being a much larger target that can only focus on a single ship at a time thanks to the reduced secondary battery. And it still isn't going to be able to get away from a Renown, a Hood, or any other truly fast capital ship. If you absolutely must have ships of this type for commerce raiding, just build more Deutschlands, or if you really have to, revisit the D-class. Both of these are cheaper, and so you're going to lose less when they get caught by the same enemies anyway, and the latter are actually capable of comfortably winning the fights the P-class was supposed to get into. Battle cruisers. To a degree, these make sense in context of what was known in 1939, but assuming war holds off long enough for them to be built, they'll be in an environment where various supercruisers like the Alaska, Stalingrad, B-65, and possibly even Churchill's 9.2-inch cruisers all exist, at which point their fewer shells and thin belt are going to mean they're not going to have much choice but to run away. Even the Hood and Renowns are in a position of relative superiority thanks to better armour. Aircraft carriers. The Graf Zeppelin was a horrible hybrid design. An aircraft carrier is not a cruiser and is not supposed to get into surface gunfights. The only exception to this was HMS Formidable at the Battle of Cape Matapan, and even then it only got off one salvo before being firmly ordered away from the battle. Now, a revised design with a single dual-purpose battery, and therefore more hangar space, might have been relatively effective, but the first two ships are just bad. With their limited air groups and intended goal, they'd be better off just filling them with fighters and using them to scout for the fleet, and defend it against the inevitable incoming air attack than try and use them in any kind of offensive role. And finally, the battleships. They're still designed for close brawling and are relatively inefficient for what they bring to the table, but in terms of pure punching power, the H-39s and their possible derivatives are otherwise pretty solid ships, assuming that the Bismarck's Achilles heel is remedied. They'd be fairly effective ships against all comers, at least until everyone starts building replies to the Yamato. From a purely technical perspective, the Z-Plan can be divided into two groups. The ships whose purposes are more general, i.e. the torpedo boats, light and heavy cruisers, and battleships, form one group, and these are all perfectly serviceable and workable designs, and would have been highly effective in their designated roles. The other group, the larger destroyers, scout cruisers, Panzerschiff, battle cruisers, and aircraft carriers, are mostly far too specialised for very specific intended roles and rely on the enemy cooperating on a tactical and strategic level with this chosen method of warfare. Their weaknesses really are far too easily exploited by both some existing units and slight changes or upgrades in design to other units that would have paralleled them in construction. Therefore, as intended, the Z-Plan fleet would likely have suffered a similar fate to the High Seas fleet. A few scattered successes overseas before being swept clean of the oceans, followed by a prolonged staring match until either Hitler orders the battle fleet out into glorious combat, or the RAF levels the docks and the surrounding few square miles that they're housed in. The lack of U-boats is really a killer to any attempt to conduct effective commerce warfare. If it were up to me to make changes, and assuming that somebody can keep Hitler locked in a room to keep him from mashing the Lebensraum button for 2 seconds, assuming that I can't ramp up U-boat production, which would be the first choice, I would probably use one of the larger torpedo boat designs to come up with a standard hull for a larger destroyer, which could then be built in either gun or torpedo variants, probably using 5 mounting points and twin turrets, swapping turrets for torpedo tube banks depending on which variant you were building. If commerce raiding is the thing we have to focus on, then I'd say scrap the scout cruisers, the Panzerschiff, and the O-class. Instead, expand the M-class run, and maybe see about a run of a few more revised Scharnhorst designs to deal with the supercruisers that will inevitably appear. Scrap the idea of a cruiser carrier, and just make them one that's about aircraft. Shoot whoever thought about using the Bf-109, and navalise the exciting new Focke-Wulf 190 instead. And if at all possible, please get someone to design a triple turret for my battleships. So there you have it, a relatively brief summary of the Z-Plan, and my take on its likely effectiveness. I'm sure people will inevitably want to look at the German Tillmans, aka the H-41 and onwards, so I guess we'll have to do that at some point as well. I hope you enjoyed this one though, and let me know in the comments if you have any disagreements or you think the Z-Plan could have been done in a different way.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.